Hey, everybody. Welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 1, Exploration 2. Remember last time we talked about atomic structure and some bonding. So now we're going to talk about is the properties of water. So water is going to be a molecule that all living organisms need to survive, right? And for different reasons. But let's talk about the specific properties of water. The first thing is that water is a polar molecule. And what that means is that the molecule is going to take on different sides. So if you were to split this molecule right down the middle, right, it would have a negative side and it would have a positive side. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow it to form hydrogen bonds later on. But that's why water is going to have specific properties. It's also why it's going to allow it to take on more heat. So it says polar molecules form when atoms in the molecule have unequal poles on the electrons that they share. Oxygen is a much greater atom. It's a larger atom. Its atomic mass is more, atomic weight. So what happens is this atom is going to pull these electrons more than the hydrogens will. So the oxygen is going to have the electrons circle it more often than the hydrogens, making it more negative and leaving the hydrogens more positive. It's going to split this molecule right down the middle. And the importance of that is that it's going to allow it to create hydrogen bonds. And it says when a hydrogen atom is part of a polar molecule, the hydrogen atom has a slightly positive charge. And because of that, you can see right here, the positive hydrogen atom is going to have an attraction to the negative oxygen atom. Now, this attraction is just magnetic, so it's not going to transfer electrons or share electrons like we talked about before. It's just going to create this slight pull. And this slight pull here is between a negative oxygen and a positive hydrogen. And it's going to create this little triangle effect, and this triangle effect with another atom and another atom. And that's going to allow it to pull and give it things like surface tension and things like that. So properties of the hydrogen bond is they are 20 times weaker than a covalent bond or an ionic bond. So these bonds are going to break way before a water molecule covalent bonds would break. So without hydrogen bonds, water would boil at a much lower temperature. So due to these hydrogen bonds, it's going to give it something that we call high specific heat. And high specific heat means that it's going to be able to absorb heat and hold more heat before it changes phases. So water is going to have a higher boiling point because it's going to absorb that heat. Cohesion is another property, and it's going to allow the water molecules to stick to each other and create surface tension. So this is going to allow these molecules right here to stick together and create more of surface tension. Adhesion is the other one, which is going to allow water to stick to other molecules and other things like the sides of glass tubing, right? And we scroll down, that's where you see, we call this a meniscus. So what happens is water has adhesion. And adhesion is going to cause it to stick to the side of the glass, and it's going to cause it to go up the glass and sink down in the middle. Molecules like mercury do not have adhesion. And so what they do is they do not stick to the side, and they have a filling effect in the middle. Okay, so water, we have what's called a meniscus, and you would read that at the bottom, where this one you would read it towards the top with mercury. Okay, so water as a solvent means that water is going to allow things to dissolve in it, like salt water, right? You put salt in water and you stir it around, and that salt is going to disappear, as it would appear to disappear. And what that means is it is dissolved in the water and it mixes. So water is what we call the solvent, right? Water is what we call the solvent, and salt would be what we call the solute. Okay, the solute. The solute right here is going to be the solid that mixes in the liquid. Okay, so water is known as the universal solvent, meaning that since it is a polar molecule, it is also going to allow all polar molecules to dissolve. However, you have seen non-polar molecules, they do not dissolve in water, like oil. So you've seen if you pour vegetable oil in water, they do not mix. And that's because oil is non-polar and water is polar, and they are not going to dissolve. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is the difference between acids and bases and why they are what they are. So an acid is when you put a molecule in with water it is going to change the molecule, and it is going to release a hydrogen ion. And the more hydrogen ions we get, the more acidic that solution becomes. Now, if a solution releases low hydrogen ions, then it's going to be more basic. And so depending on how many hydrogen ions we have in the solution, that's going to make it more basic, right? Somewhere in the middle is what we call neutral. That's where pure water would fit. Also, blood and bile are going to be very close to the 7, 8, 9. However, our stomach acid is going to be a very strong, very acidic acid. Okay. Now what we're going to do here as well is we're going to combine exploration 2 right up here, and we're going to combine exploration 3. So right now I'm going to talk about exploration 3, which is chemical reactions and enzymes. And so a chemical reaction is a process of taking two molecules, mixing them together. They break apart and form new molecules. And those new molecules are going to either have a greater energy component or they're going to have less of an energy component. So here we see a chemical reaction that says the process by which substances change into different substances, and that's the key, through the breaking and forming of chemical bonds. So what's going to happen is we're going to have covalent or ionic bonds, and they're going to break, and then they're going to form new bonds. And that's either going to absorb energy because it needs energy to happen, or it's going to release energy. And when it releases energy, it releases it in the form of light or heat. That's where you get hot packs. That's where you get glow sticks. That's releasing that type of energy. So to understand in chemical reactions, you need to understand inputs and outputs. Basically, what's going into the reaction and then what's leaving or what's coming out of the reaction. So when we look down here, here's a perfect reaction of hydrogen peroxide, and we're going to split it into water and oxygen. Right? This is the stuff in the brown bottle, right? And when you pour it on your cut, what's going to happen is it's going to break and it's going to form water and oxygen. The water is going to help clean out the cut, and the oxygen is going to be the bubbles that you see when that happens. But what's going to happen is we are going to break these bonds apart. And when we break these bonds apart, we are then going to reform them in the form of water and then one oxygen O2 molecule. This is an example of a chemical reaction. So we started with two hydrogen peroxide molecules. We're going to break all these bonds apart. Think about Legos. We're going to break these pieces apart, and then we're going to re-put them together in a new form. So instead of forming H2O2, we're going to form H2O, and we're going to get two of those, and we're going to have two oxygens left over, and we're going to bond those together. That's a chemical reaction. This is one type of molecule, and we're creating a different type of molecule. Okay, so as we scroll down here, we're going to talk about, let's keep going, chemical equilibrium, right? And we're going to talk about, okay, as we come down here, actually, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about activation energy. So what activation energy is it's the amount of energy we need to put in to get those molecules to break. Okay, so what we talk about says during the chemical reaction, energy is both absorbed and released. Some chemical reactions absorb more energy than they release, while other reactions release more energy than they absorb. And this is what we're going to talk about with endothermic and exothermic reactions. So the activation energy is this right here. It's this amount of energy right here that we have to put into the reactants to then get these molecules to break. So right here is where these molecules are going to break apart. Then down here is where they're going to get put back together. But what you're going to see is when you make these molecules, there's going to be a release of energy. This energy goes out into the atmosphere and out into the environment. This is what we call an exothermic reaction. Okay, so as we scroll down, here we go. So endothermic and exothermic. Endothermic is when we are going to take energy and we are going to put it in to the reaction. So in an endothermic reaction, the products have a higher bond energy than the reactants. So let's talk about that graph. We should have a graph down here. Here we go. Here is an endothermic reaction. And what that means is when we put in this energy, we put in all this activation energy. But when those molecules break, when they form the new molecules, the products, it is going to store this much energy because we started with this much and now we have this much. So this amount of energy is being stored in these molecules. Now, when we go to an exothermic reaction is going to be the other reaction where we are going to release energy. So we start with this much energy in the molecules. We add some energy. It causes those molecules to break apart. It's breaking the Legos. We shatter them. Then when we put those Legos back together, there is less energy in the new molecules. Well, that energy has to go somewhere. And that energy is going to escape into the atmosphere and into the environment, but this is going to release energy. This could be a hot pack, right? When you get a hot pack, you have energy, but when you mix it together and you stir up those molecules, it is going to break them, and then the new products are down here. This is going to be the heat given off, okay? Or maybe a glow stick. This is going to be the light released, okay? So as we scroll down, the last thing that we need to talk about are what is a catalyst. And a catalyst is an enzyme that is going to speed up the reaction, or it's going to lower the activation energy. So as we come down here, this is the exact same exothermic graph that we were looking at before. Here was the amount of activation energy that we needed to break these molecules apart. Well, what happens is when we add a catalyst is going to make that activation energy less. So what happens is we need to use less energy to break those molecules apart with the help of a catalyst, which is an enzyme. It's a protein. Okay? So when we do that, we're actually able to save energy and release this amount of energy while putting less in. Okay? That's a catalyst. An enzyme is an example of a catalyst. It's going to be a protein that catalyzes chemical reactions for organisms. So if this reaction right here takes place inside of a living organism, then this catalyst is known as an enzyme. That's its name. It's called an enzyme. Okay? So as we go down here, it says enzyme structures is important because each enzyme's shape allows only certain reactions to take place in the enzyme. So this right here is a molecule of maltose, which is a type of sugar. And this is the enzyme that's going to break it apart. And what you'll notice is this fits in here. However, then it's going to fit in, and this enzyme's job is to break it apart. So this enzyme is going to then break these apart. And so what maltose is two glucose molecules, one here and one here binding together. But if we want to break this back down into glucose so we can use it, that maltose is going to fit into the site, and then this enzyme is going to break it apart and allow us to have two glucose molecules to break apart in cellular respiration. So this would be an enzyme, and this is going to be what's called lock and key. It's going to fit in there. But for example, if you were trying to look at fructose would not fit. The enzyme would be a different shape, and therefore it would not work the same way. Okay, here's an example. It says enzymes work best in a limited temperature range. So if it gets too hot, what's going to happen is this is what the enzyme looks like. But what happens is if you get too hot or you cook the protein, it's going to denature. And denature means it's going to basically lose its shape and not work. So this enzyme is going to work properly. But when the enzyme looks like this, it's not going to work properly, and it's not going to be able to do its job. Okay? So when we take an egg, the white is protein. So what happens is when we cook the egg, the protein is supposed to look like this clear stuff. The problem is when we cook it, we are denaturing the protein, and that protein of this egg will not work anymore. It changes its shape, it changes its texture, and we like it cooked versus the uncooked version. And so that's a denaturing of a protein. So that ends our Unit 2.1.2 video and 2.1.3 video. And I hope that has helped you understand what we are doing here and helps you understand what we want to do.